I'm very glad to be here with you. My name, as you know, is Father Lino Otero. And this presentation is going to be about some elements on a philosophy of economics, social ethics, and social doctrine of the church. I'd like to present to you some of the points that are going to be very relevant in order to understand what is happening in society today. I think it is something that many of us wonder. What are the big changes, the paradigm shifts that are taking place in our contemporary world in the last, let's say, 5 years, which is big. And this has been a passion of mine to understand what is going on. But greater passion still is the passion to be able to do something about it. And this is part of our mission. To give you a little bit of an introduction about myself, I was born in Nicaragua, one of the poorest countries in Latin America, in a time when there were a lot of hopes. I grew up in the 70s, and we had already gone through almost 50 years in which the regime had been in power, and there was a lot of dissatisfaction. There was signs of corruption, and people wanted change, and there were hopes for a future. My family got entangled into that idealism, and we wanted change. I remember as a 10-year-old coming to the United States for the first time and going back, and I enjoyed going to Disneyland for the first time in my life, and just dreaming one day how beautiful it would be to have something like this for the children of Nicaragua. My family had not been very wealthy, and my mom had made sure that we understand the conditions of poor people. She herself had to grow up in the midst of poverty. And even though we were more like middle class, however, she took it upon herself that we appreciate what we had, that we learn how poor people live, that we go into their houses, that we see how they live. And so I grew up with these great expectations that things could change. As a child, also, we went to Costa Rica, which at the time, for me, it was such a contrast, and dreaming that the country could become a little bit better. And all those hopes eventually crashed. I remember the day of the revolution, and my family went out to celebrate, just with so many people. And that's when the problems started. My dad was a business manager, worked for a wealthy man who had quite a few businesses. And right at the very beginning, it was the troubles with the labor union, which was controlled by the party, of course, and trying to accuse the business owner or managers of what they would say would be the denationalization or the retreat of funds, and trying to empty the company of its resources in order to take them to outside of the country. And my dad was even trying to pay the workers during the time when they didn't work. There was war, and he was being accused on top of that. And there was so much stress. Eventually he was sent to work in another company where he tried to use all the resources of the company in order to provide for the workers, to provide for medicine, for hospitalization, for a clubhouse, for a lunch. And as the workers were siding with my dad, the accusations now were not that he was taking the money outside of the country, but that he was just using this in order to avoid paying taxes. One thing after another, he was finding himself cornered, accused of being a counter-revolutionary, We had even an armed car coming home, threatening us, and eventually we had to leave. The government passed a law soon around that time that stated that anybody that was outside of the country would lose anything that they had if you were outside of the country for more than 6 months. And the 15 companies that my dad's boss owned, they were totally nationalized, confiscated. That was happening one after another. It was just a matter of time. My parents just owned a house. We left with $10,000. That was the savings that we had. And the house eventually, with the inflation, rampant inflation that took place in the country, the only thing that we could take out of the house was $3,000. That was it. However, for me, the hurt to see those hopes crashing down, and what is happening today in Latin America has been in my heart since I was a child and a teenager. And the fight for social justice, how many people's lives are destroyed. Now Venezuela, Nicaragua, Cuba, one country after another just hurting. And so I wanted to show you today, going a little bit deeper into the causes. What are the causes? What is going on? In order to understand the macro picture. But before we do that, we're going to have a video. And I would like you to take advantage of this time while we watch this video. The video is going to be like an appetizer. Tomorrow and the day after, we're going to have the real presentation and the question and answers. We'll see if we have time after the video so that we can begin with some of the questions and answers. But this is going to be kind of like an appetizer to get us started. This video is going to talk about the increase in the money supply and now how that eventually brings about social inequality, wealth inequality, and we will explore the unintended consequences that devastate the life of millions of people. So let's begin.
This episode is a more detailed follow-up to my 2017 video, Who Controls All of Our Money? I'm going to focus on the United States in this video only because they're the world reserve currency. But everything in this video affects all of us because the central banks around the world are all doing the same thing. With that being said, let's begin. Around the world today, we see central banks printing money. So here's a question. We're told from a young age that money is hard to come by. We should study to work our whole life to earn it. How then can all this money suddenly come from nowhere? How is money created? Who's going to pay it back? What exactly does all of this mean? And what's going to happen next? In this episode, we'll explore the 3 ways that money is being created and some of the consequences that are going to happen. I'm also going to show you the true origins of wealth inequality. If you watch this episode the whole way through, you should have a well-rounded idea of what's going on today. It's important for people to know. I'm really just trying to help with that. This journey starts off simple enough, but by the end, you'll start to see the insanity of what we're dealing with.
You are watching Cold Fusion TV.
The first form of money is the one created by government. In practice, it's outsourced to the central bank Royal Mint, but controlled by the government. Physical money comes in 2 forms, either paper money or coins. This physical money is a tiny fraction of the economy, and in many economies, this kind of money only makes up about 3 to 8%. This physical money is created in order to meet the obligations of private banks. When you go to an ATM and try to withdraw cash, banks need to make sure that they have enough cash in order to meet those obligations. The more money you have in circulation, the less it's worth. And that's a key point. For example, if massive inflation takes place and the average Joe has $1 million, but that $1 million only buys an apple, how much is $1 million actually worth? The loss in purchasing power of money over time is called inflation, and when inflation gets out of hand, money becomes worthless. Some recent examples of runaway inflation include Argentina, Zimbabwe, and Venezuela. In this animation, you can graphically see just how fast inflation can run away. You don't see it coming, and as the inflation rate goes up, people quickly lose faith in the currency. For example, here we can see some people in Venezuela using money to make handbags and to draw pictures on because it simply isn't worth anything anymore. You can think of money as a measuring stick of value, a measuring stick that is highly elastic and can change depending on how much of it there is. For thousands of years, gold was the measuring stick of value. Gold was kind of like a physical anchor, keeping the money supply in check and governments responsible. In 1971, President Richard Nixon announced that the United States would no longer convert dollars to gold at a fixed value. Since that point, money, the measuring stick of value, has become elastic. Since the US dollar backs all other currencies as a reserve currency, Nixon's decision changed the world. In all of this, you might still notice that despite politicians supposedly not being able to influence money creation, it's happening anyway. This may cause problems, as we'll see later in the episode. So to recap, the government creates physical forms of money, like notes and coins. Only about 3 to 8% of money is made this way. Signage is the income from that physical money. This income is both a benefit to the government and the taxpayer. It reduces debt for the government and reduces the burden on the individual taxpayer. The reason governments don't create more of this money is because of the inflation risk from politicians' decisions. Let's move on to number 2, private banks and debt-based money. The vast amount of money created today is done by the private banking sector. In most developed economies, about 97% of the entire money supply is created digitally by banks, and therefore most money in the world is privatized. Banks invented digital money when they managed to persuade lawmakers after many early bank runs. A bank run is an event where depositors try to get their money out all at once, but the banks don't have it. From these events, banks argued that they should be legally allowed to create more deposits than actually exist based upon debt, and this is how governments outsourced the creation of digital money. The idea of using debt as money begins much earlier than this. English innovators set the stage for banks to become the creators of money across the globe. In 1704, the English Parliament passed the Promissory Notes Act. Take a good look at your screen. What you are seeing is a promissory note. In this case, it's a written promise to say that you'll pay back the $20 you borrowed. Under the law, this piece of paper was as good as $20. Today, we digitize this agreement and call it debt. If it helps, whenever I say debt in this episode, you can think of this piece of paper, remembering that it's as good as money. Okay, so banks were authorized to be able to use these debt notes to circulate as money. From this point, banks were free to create and destroy debt and hence money from themselves rented out at interest. In the modern world, as you'll see, the whole world's economy is based upon these promises. Let's take a look at how it works today. When you go to a bank to borrow some money, the banking license gives that bank the ability to create money every time they issue a loan. They do this through the double accounting system. For example, if you buy a $500,000 house, the bank creates $500,000 in their account and you have $500,000 in debt. That is, the promise to pay it back with interest. This $500,000 debt can enter the wider economic system because when you purchase the house, the owner of that house can use that fresh debt that was created by the bank that they received from you to buy other things in the economy. This means in our current system, if we want to have more growth, we need more debt. The key point here is that debt is actually money, just from a different point of view. To the lender, it's an asset of money, and to the borrower, it's a liability of debt. But they are one and the same. It sounds a bit complicated, but all you need to know is that when a bank issues a loan, it's not somebody else's savings. It's not money that the bank had. It's essentially brand new money that they create. They simply type it into a computer and it appears as a digital representation of the government's money which you can spend. The beneficiary of this brand new money is actually the bank because they get to charge interest on that money, and that's how they make a profit. Later, when you repay this loan, the debt disappears and the money also disappears, but the bank's profit from the interest remains. The real estate and property markets are the largest tools for creating digital money. This is because banks have decided that it's the safest yet most profitable form of creating debt, because if you can't repay the loan, the banks can simply take your house. In developed nations, vast amounts of money is backed by the mortgage market. In Australia, where I live, it's become particularly bad. For decades now, the banks have abandoned investment into the wider economy and have shifted their focus to investments in housing. This has pushed up the housing prices as people take on more debts to buy houses that they otherwise couldn't afford, but the banks make more money. This cycle over many decades has caused one of the biggest property bubbles on the planet.
We're addicted to debt.
Yes, we're addicted to debt as individuals, as households. The ratios are way higher than almost every other country.
So that's loans. But what about deposits? When you deposit cash into a bank, you are no longer the legal owner of that money. The banks are. They keep 10% of your deposits on reserve and can loan out 90% of that money to someone else. And that other person can deposit that money into another bank, and then that bank can loan out 90%, and so on. This is known as fractional reserve lending.
If they say, we'll transfer it to your account, that's wrong, because no money is transferred at all. Because what we call a deposit is simply the bank's record of its debt to the public. Now, it also owes you money, and its record of the money it owes you is what you think you're getting as money, and that's all it is.
When all is said and done, an initial deposit of $100 with a 10% reserve requirement can ultimately lead to $1,000 in total money circulation. Well, at least that was how it used to work. Until March the 26th, 2020, there is now a 0% reserve requirement. According to the Federal Reserve, quote, "This action eliminated reserve requirements for all depository institutions," end quote. So, banks can now create infinite amounts of money with no reserves. And it doesn't stop there. When banks hold your deposit, they can, along with hedge funds, gamble with it through investment in financial instruments such as derivatives and securities. They do this in order to make superior returns. Most of the time, these instruments are basically just bets on if the price of an asset will rise or fall. But when taken to the extreme, it can get ridiculous. Remember in my Enron video how I talked about how they use financial instruments to bet on the weather? These crazy classes of financial instruments is what brought down the housing market and the subsequent global economy in 2008. But the problem today is that banks are playing with so many derivatives, sometimes stacked on top of each other, with leverage multiplying factors, that nobody actually knows how much money is tied up in this gambling. Some estimates put the derivative market at over $1 quadrillion, over 10 times the global economy. In booms, everyone takes on debt, that is, loans from a bank, and they spend it on things that they normally couldn't afford, but this causes economic growth. Eventually, people can't afford to take on more debt and can't pay it back. The banks stop lending and defaults start to take place, and the economy takes a downturn. This is natural and has happened over centuries. But in 2008, everything changed. The world didn't want to go through the pain of a downturn, and some analysts mark this as the very point that the real economy died. In 2008, banks had become so large, intertwined, and integral to the supply of money that when they were about to collapse, the governments had to use the central banks to bail them out. Remember, banks are creating 97% of all money as debt, and if this can't be paid back, it can cause a systemic failure, a risk of collapse of the entire global monetary system. Since 2008, the economy was dead, but has been on life support ever since. A decade of hyper-low interest rates, which basically make the cost of borrowing money free, have caused market distortions so large that it's compounded the entire problem. It was short-term gains for the consequence of long-term pain. When private banks make risky bets and incur losses, central banks can rescue them with their infinite wallet, as mentioned by Fed Chairman Jerome Powell in a recent interview for CNBC's 60 Minutes.
Fair to say you simply flooded the system with money?
Yes, we did. That's another way to think about it. We did.
Where does it come from? Do you just print it?
We print it digitally. So we, as a central bank, we have the ability to create money digitally, and we do that by buying treasury bills or bonds or other government-guaranteed securities, and that actually increases the money supply.
But by law, Chairman Powell's Federal Reserve can only lend money that must be paid back.
We'll get to central banks in the next section. But as you'll soon see, we have to pay these debts back. All of this money that's being created is like that piece of paper we saw with the promise on it. Except it's signed by all of us, and we signed that we're going to pay this back through taxation. Us and our future generations. It's important to note that governments don't actually support the people. It's the people that support governments through taxation. Taxation and trade are the two major ways that governments can raise money. This raised money is used to pay back the central bank loans with interest. So when governments use the central banks to bail out private banks for their risky behaviour, the governments are left with the debt, which eventually has to be paid back by the taxpayers in the future. So to recap, private banks create the vast majority of money, about 97% of it, and they do so by creating loans, which is debt. The process is as simple as typing numbers into a computer. Banks can, to an extent, spend and gamble consumer deposits as they legally own it. Too big to fail banks are backed up by the central bank, creating a moral hazard. And that brings us to the final and most insane form of money creation: central bank digital money. The third form of money is quantitative easing, or QE. Quantitative easing is a new form of money that was invented by the Japanese central bank in 1989. It was later popularized by the Federal Reserve in the United States during the 2008 crisis. QE is where a central bank creates money in order to issue loans directly to the banking sector, large corporations, and most recently, the public. It's a way of flooding money into the economy at times of extreme events like the financial crisis of 2008. As a result of this, the central bank's balance sheets have gone completely out of control in order to prop up the economy a little bit longer. In 2008, during the crisis, and the first time this was tried outside of Japan, the $700 billion bailout of QE was very controversial.
Bailing out Wall Street is the only way to save Main Street, so says the president.
The house of cards was much bigger. Started to stretch beyond just Wall Street.
That's how the president defended one of the largest proposed financial rescue plans in U.S. history. Treasury Department and congressional staffers are working through the weekend, hammering out the details. The president's plan would allow the Treasury to buy up to $700 billion worth of bad loans, like many of those subprime mortgage deals. But those bad debts then go on the American public's tab. Congress will have to raise the legal limit on the national debt from $10.6 trillion to $11.3 trillion.
It was thought to be a one-off emergency scenario, but over the next decade, the Federal Reserve was unable to reverse it. To give you an idea of how significant all of this was, It took from the foundation of America in 1776 all the way up to 2008 for the nation to attain less than $1 trillion in debt. By 2014, that number had expanded to 4.4 trillion, and since the onset of the COVID pandemic, 3 trillion was added in the span of 3 months. Now, the US central bank is creating hundreds of billions of dollars in mere hours. It's seeming to have less of an effect as it continues.
We have a lot of good faith based on the prowess of the U.S. printing press. I mean, the United States maintains reserve currency status.
That's fake money, though. That's not real money. That's fake money. That's $200 trillion of fake money.
Oh, you're really? I know. But it's all based on faith.
How long is it sustainable, though,
Wow.
to go at that pace? The argument then becomes about the taxpayer who's pissed off and saying, let me get this straight. You can constantly bail yourself out and you can constantly go print money with this quantitative easing. Why the hell do I have to pay taxes? Why do I pay taxes?
These are the seeds of social unrest in this country. You can only drive so big of a wedge between the haves and the have-nots, especially when you're gutting out the middle class in the process. The Federal Reserve monetizing the US debt is what enables all of this.
So how does this money enter the system? Central banks use their magic money to buy the equivalent amount of bonds from the government. They do this through the bond market, which exists to lend money to corporations or governments. Although the stock market gets more press, the bond market is actually bigger. So what is a bond? For the purposes of this video, it's basically the same as debt but is issued by a government or corporation. Central banks, which have no savings, can create money to buy these bonds. So here's an important question. Can a central bank go bankrupt? Well, according to the European Central Bank, which published a paper in 2016, central banks are protected from insolvency due to their ability to create more money. If you think this sounds a bit unfair, just wait. Governments in our current situation are stuck between a rock and a hard place. They can't raise money except for raising taxes, but owe trillions to central banks. The hope is that the borrowed money can kickstart the economy, but something else is happening. When central banks buy bonds given by the government or corporations, they can end up owning a lot of the world's assets. For example, the balance sheet of the Japanese central bank is bigger than the entire GDP of Japan. They own 80% of their stock market. That's right, the Central Bank of Japan is their stock market's largest shareholder. The Swiss Central Bank owns $90 billion in American stocks, including Apple, Microsoft, Google, and Amazon. When I first heard of this a few years ago, I simply couldn't believe it was legal. So, these central banks are creating money out of nothing, and they can't go bankrupt, but yet, they're buying real assets. Even a toddler can see that something is wrong here. It turns out that creating money out of nothing and buying things does have some consequences. These sorts of central bank interventions remove stock markets from reality. Throughout the 20th century, the stock market actually used to reflect the economy, but recently, that's gone completely out of whack. The US stock market has become almost twice as big as the entire nation's GDP, which literally makes no sense. Central bank intervention is the main reason why in April 2020, 30 million people became unemployed in the United States, but the stock market had its best month since 1987. The central bank printed trillions, gave it to banks and hedge funds, with almost 0% interest rates. This money made it straight into the stock market, while the real economy barely got any help. Earlier, we discussed that money printing leads to inflation. So why haven't we seen it yet? Well, we have. We've seen inflation globally in housing prices and stock markets. The printed money ends up in all of these assets pushing up the prices, so the few people who own large amounts of stocks end up ridiculously wealthy while there's no growth in the real economy. The rich get richer and the poor get poorer. A lot of people can feel and see the wealth inequality, but they have no idea where it's coming from. I'm going to show you in 3 charts. Since the 1980s, the wealth of the upper echelons of society has been tied to the stock market. Since 2008, when the economy went on life support, the stock market became glued to the Federal Reserve. The more they print, the more the stock market goes up, and the richer they become. Since 1980, their wealth has grown 420%. When central banks print money, the first recipients of that newly printed money enjoy higher standards of living at the expense of the later recipients of that money when inflation has already taken hold. This phenomena is known as the Cantillon effect. Experts believe that when the rich finally start selling their stocks and real estate so as to buy other assets in times of distress, the money velocity, that is, the rate at which money changes hands in the economy, will start to pick up, and that is when we'll start seeing real inflation in the general economy. There is so much more to this, but I'll leave it here for today. So to recap, central banks have no savings in their account. They can't go bankrupt, but can create infinite amounts of money by buying government bonds. A bond is an exchange of money for a promise that the government would eventually pay it back with interest. This money eventually must be paid back by future citizens of a country either through taxation or inflation. So what's going to happen next? In my view, I think this is all going to lead to something very big and unpleasant over the next decade. I don't know how it's going to look like, but it may involve massive amounts of inflation and slow economic growth, a situation known as stagflation. This happened in the 1970s, but this time it could be much worse due to excessive amounts of debt with the added effect of social instability. The way money is created and the overall banking system seems like madness, and people have started to notice that the system is no longer working. The monetary system is so ingrained and so pervasive it becomes invisible to see. Nobody ever questioned it. When things started going wrong, they pointed at the things that were visible, things that look like problems, surface issues which you could see and understand. Looking at the surface, some would point the finger at capitalism, but you have to dig deeper. And when you do, you can see it's an unfortunate and untimely mix of the debt-based system, extreme financialization, moral hazards, and a rampant Cantillon effect that's causing extreme fragility and ever-increasing amounts of massive wealth inequality.
Could I have someone pick up the cards? I'd like to review some of the questions that you have. If we have time, we can go through some of them, and I'll be taking into account these questions for the presentation tomorrow, because we need to now break this a little bit apart in order to understand it in slow motion. So if anybody has questions and you have filled them out in the card, could you raise your hand so that brother can pick them up and hand them over to me? Okay. That's fine. You can turn those in at this moment and then collect the rest. Okay, thank you. There's a question here that seems interesting. Social justice, and I believe the good intention of the people. That's one of the things that we heard. But is there something else that we and us and we can do and that we can teach regarding the one for money for the good of countries? Yes, we will talk about what this really means, and because this, as the author said, this is happening in every country. How is it that this type of financialization became so rampant? And there are economic philosophies I'll mention John Maynard Keynes and Keynesian economics. That is one of the, let's say, the leading philosophies of economics that justify, with good intentions, some of these activities. But as we can see, there are unintended consequences. You see someone that is sick, and you give him a remedy that eventually makes him worse off than the cure. And that's some of the things that we are seeing when we increase the money supply. At the beginning, I talked about hope. Pope Benedict XVI also talks about, has a reflection on theology of liberation. And then he talks also about eschatology and hope. And he presents this as an important element in today's world. However, on the other hand, we have the social doctrine of the church that says that Christianity there are some who criticize the social doctrine of the church, saying that Christianity doesn't solve the social problem, the social question, but it perpetuates it. This is Marx's critique on religion, on what is our attitude behind this critique. We will also talk about this tomorrow. What is inflation, and how do we approach it? What is that about? Okay, one of the things that I'll mention, and we will see this a little bit more tomorrow. I'm doing a doctorate in philosophy of economics. I am very concerned in social inequality. And one of the last points that we saw here was called the Cantillon effect. Richard Cantillon was an economist, Irish-French economist in the 1700s. And he was the first one to see how the increase in the money supply, and back then it was the case in the 1500s Spain, bringing all this gold from Latin America. But sometimes we think that all the Spaniards got rich. Not so. Of course, that a few did. But new gold doesn't mean wealth. Money is a measuring stick of value. The real wealth is the productivity of the nation, of the people. How much do you produce that you can consume? You don't eat the gold. You use it in order to change and interchange things. So what happened in reality with the economy of Spain, with the banks lending money, especially to King Philip II in the 1500s, money that he couldn't pay back because of the defeat of the Spanish Armada and the collapse of the Spanish economy that never recovered from its golden age, and the repercussions that all of that had across Europe were tremendous. So much so that because even back then, banks were using this, what is called the fractional reserve system. That means that you put $1,000 in the bank, but the bank goes and he lends that money to someone else. Now, you assume that you have that money in the bank and that you can take it back anytime that you want. But what if that other guy doesn't pay back? Where is the bank going to take money in order to pay you? But you said to the bank, you know, I gave you my money. I want it back on demand. The bank says, I don't have it. You know, that's a bank run. And that was happening in Spain. And so eventually in the 1800s, the Bank of Amsterdam said, no, we're going to have 100% reserve ratios. It was great as long as they could do it. But what happens? Government going to war. They want to borrow more than what the banks have. That's part of the problem. It happened huge. Why did the world live in the early 1900s the gold standard, which eventually Nixon had to completely dissociate, in a sense, leave the gold standard in the 70s, dissociate. It is because World War I, the Great War, the expense of that war was amazing. You know, so you have a situation where, because banks are running out of money in order to pay you the money, then eventually what do they have to do? The governments create a central bank that can print money so that the banks don't go bankrupt. But that is the solution that creates even more problems, because now you are printing money. And the Cantillon effect says that the first ones who receive it, are the winners. Why? Because prices have not risen yet. So you're a central bank, and you get all these loans, and the houses are still worth $500,000. You say, that's a great investment. And you, as a bank, go and buy 1,000 houses. But you know what happens when you buy 1,000 houses? The prices of the houses go up. Now you're the simple Joe that wants to buy a house. That house that last year was at $500,000, now it's going to be worth $700,000, because the banks bought those houses. Greater demand, greater the number of the price level. So Joe, who wants to buy a house, now he saw that his money is worth less with regards to buying houses. And he doesn't have money to be able to buy a house. And so many young people today find themselves that they cannot buy a home. But you have these financial institutions that are getting all these loans, supposedly in order to stimulate the economy. And you have those who invest in those financial institutions who are receiving great dividends, because those homes that they bought for $500,000 are worth now $700,000, and they're getting a lot of interest on all that as they're being rented out. And you have some people making millions and millions of dollars while you're struggling in order to pay your mortgage, or in order to be able to pay rent in order to get by. And so this is the tragedy that we are living in every country, unfortunately. We will see tomorrow the philosophy. What is the thinking that got us into this problem? And what are the repercussions? Because the United States is the dollar is the global reserve currency. So this phenomenon is not happening only at the level of the United States, and the majority of Americans are hurting. But it is happening globally. So there are countries, some of them totalitarian, who are saying, United States with the dollar is hurting us. Whenever they print trillions of dollars, our dollars that we need in order to buy among countries are worth less. And they're saying we're de-dollarizing our economies. That is going to have tremendous consequences in the next few years. And so we're seeing a multipolar world with rising economies in the East that are presenting a challenge to the world situation today. That is just, well, tomorrow we'll go a little bit deeper into the philosophy of how this works in order to understand. I'll present a very simple scenario. We'll start with a lemonade stand, you know, to understand concepts. but then we will see how they apply to many different scenarios to understand what's happening in the, to people today and in the world at large. Let's stand and finish with a prayer. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit, amen. We give you thanks, Almighty God, for this and all your benefits, you who live and reign forever and ever. Amen. Christ our King, Virgin most prudent Mary, Mother of the Church, in the name of the Father, and Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen.